Hey, good to see you.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Fantastic. I would say we just get started and so we can get the most out of this. I can lay a few ground rules. Um, we do not want to position any products. We don't want to talk about any products. Um, and that, holds true for myself. But for everybody else as well. Also no services. So this is really just about, discussing approaches to platform engineering. Um, this is sort of a little bit of a, I don't know, community get together. So we should treat it as such. We always have a spotlight guest that I'll let
Seeing Casper talking, but I can't hear him.
himself introduce. You can't, can nobody hear me?
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yeah.
Actually, I can hear you.
Okay, so most people can hear you. This seems to be on your end.
Might
Then
be
I'm
me.
here.
we cannot really promise that nothing will leave this room because we can't really control everything. But we will try to keep the things that we discuss here to ourselves. Obviously, don't share too much of intricate details, but we should consider this a safe space. If you want to say something, just raise your hand. I'll make sure that I'm observing this, and I'll hand over to you. We can discuss everything. Like, this is a very broad topic, and usually these discussions get very fruitful. This is for the ground rules. I am Caspar. I do a lot of platform engineering initiatives. I try to be very hands-on and actually, do the stuff I'm preaching. And with me today is Jordan. Jordan, you want to introduce yourself and maybe start telling us a little bit, key learnings in this field and what are the things that, like that can avoid disasters in platforming. I think this is the stuff that's often the most interesting.
Sure. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. A little bit about me. Probably about 20 years of industry experience at this point in time. I used to be a former practitioner. I came from the system side and not necessarily the developer side. And over time, I helped out to build different organizations, products. Most notably, I was with Wayfair for about 13 years. We built a lot of the things that we're going to discuss today in practice during the course of, I would say, 2021 over to 24, I would say. So yeah, saw it in practice, saw some of the challenges, saw some of the scale, the limitations, the changing of the mental model away to be more of a product orientation. Happy to share the thoughts, the lessons that I have seen. Though some of you may have even seen or experienced these pain points yourselves. The top takeaways I would say is modeling the way that the existing teams think and operate. I think that's probably the biggest one. Most of you, depending on how evolved you are, maybe you don't have particular product backlogs. Maybe you have a technology orientation. You may have been a little bit more friendly or kind of trying to help specific developer patterns or experiences or friction points in your environments. Maybe it's okay to say that some of us didn't necessarily think about the end-to-end customer journey around a particular customer experience. Now, to those of us who have been in prior product roles, maybe you were developing application software development, that becomes more of a, hey, this seems like I don't know, a no-brainer. It's difficult for us to convey that to a platform or I don't know, traditional DevOps team that historically have had to observe and operate at a horizontal scale as opposed to a vertical type of experience, if you will. So evolving your team's mindset orientation to become product-like, I think, is probably the biggest one. And when I say that, you have to really not just think about hiring product people on the team. You really have to evolve the culture so everybody in the team thinks product first. So once you make that leap, adding product managers, that basically starts to accelerate that later on. So to me, that's kind of one of the biggest takeaways, if you will. I would say meeting customers where they're at. Again, moving away from technology-oriented backlogs or approach. So it's more around like, a particular, I would say maybe a customer experience or something that you're trying to optimize for or remove friction, create delight, maybe even like an optimize for a particular product that people love or leverage. I think that's probably the one that is probably the second pitfall. Too many technology teams, they have been, I would say, incentivized or almost hardwired to actually operate and build technology-oriented solutions, which some of them could actually like, hit the mark without them knowing about it. But in most cases, it was, hey, maybe it's slightly different from what the developer teams needed to focus on. The last one that kind of like, comes to mind is make sure that you're trying to meet where your customers are at any given point in time. It's imperative that you create consistent feedback loops, and like, continuously, so you can listen to monitor for feedback. What are some like, key takeaways? How can I get particular like, voice or mindset from the community? How do I which of these members from the product community can I corral and actually pull in to be, I don't know, say early adopters for a private feature thinking about like, an alpha or a private preview, or how can I graduate those to be like, from the early adopters to kind of like, early majority? How can I leverage them to be a part of the community to sort of like, socialize and help me speak not just in tech, but also like, in business terms to the rest of my audiences. I'm gonna take a pause right here. I'm sure there are like a lot of ones that I can sort of like, mention, but I want to take a stop here before I go too deep on any of these. And I think we're getting maybe feedback from someone.
Mm.
Yeah. Go ahead, Casper.
No, fantastic. Any immediate, reaction? I'll if there's anybody who has specific questions, really just raise your hand and I'll hand over. But before that happens, or while we're waiting for folks to jump in, talking about meeting the customer where the customer is, and you said that this is a non-technological angle. We always have these two sides, socio side and technical side. I've lately, observed that this also has a technology component, right? Like essentially on the interface side of the platform. So what interfaces do we give the consumer to actually consume the platform capabilities and paths? Can you highlight a little bit like what were the when you worked on this for Wayfair, what are the interfaces for consuming platform services that you opted for?
Sure. It's very simply opted from an API first orientation, which is probably like, the, I don't know, the basic building block of how we want teams to consume our services. Yeah, let's see if we can fix that. Difficult for people to hear.
Sorry, Krunal, could you please mute yourself? Thank you very much.
There we go. All right. Yeah, we started with an API-centric orientation that more or less was able to provide programmatic capabilities to the different teams. It wasn't necessarily about, to your point, like, it wasn't necessarily about what the platform could provide. It's also how you access it. And to most teams, being able to automate or sort of like, provide a certain level of like an abstraction layer without creating, I don't know, just leaky wrappers, like abstraction layers. I think that was the important piece. We tried experimenting with CLIs, but I think where we sort of like, run into a bit of a, I don't know, it seems obvious in retrospect, problem was it was the distribution. Too many of our users, some of them were running on Windows, some of them were running on Mac, some of them were running on Linux, and effectively that more or less created too much of a, I don't know, our development effort started to spiral into supporting different operating systems as opposed to kind of like, driving functionality, like, feature set through the CLIs themselves. So effectively, over time, we decided to, hey, let's scale back to just an API and not necessarily go too deep on CLIs. once we had the API layer, it was relatively easy for us to add a particular UI presentation to some folks in this room. That could be the, I don't know, the buzzword of, hey, we now have a developer portal. We can do those types of things. I would recommend that you only start creating the UIs after you have the functional APIs. So while you're kind of doing that at a socio-technological kind of like, landscape of users adapting your systems, you want to make sure that they have APIs that already deliver value to them. The UI just becomes for them to consume or interact with those interfaces a little bit more easily. Maybe similar to a ClickOps model that requires a lot less education, knowledge, as opposed to them like, not having that in the first place. And hey, this UI is fancy, this UI looks cool, but I don't necessarily see value in me logging into that interface to begin with.
You're making this is such an incredible important point. The fact that the model capability, the platform capabilities need to have API endpoints, so we can, we can actually, we can codify them, we can put them into infrastructure as code. We can call them from any interface. Can you? And I think this is you're saying this as if this is so obvious. I think like very like too few platform initiatives have actually really grasped that concept. Can you like dive a little deeper on how you've designed that API and how this was structured?
Sure. Obviously, this is something that the team that I led in terms of like, specific and intricate, like, low-level design was doing on their own. But I'll be able to describe it to the group at a higher level. We used some of the more modern interfaces around, I think we were using a fast API to provide us with just like, the API wrapper and the API layer that would provide us that kind of like, just generic, like, mechanics of an API. And then behind it, we would just like, start putting all the different, like, specific, I would say, platform logic, if you will. For some of the kind of like, more straightforward automation languages, they already have their own APIs. So for instance, I don't know, depending on who you are, that's infrastructure as code. I'll mention just a few products to exemplify what those are, not necessarily to focus on pros or cons. Most of you know probably like, Terraform, Pulumi, any of the cloud CDKs, any of the specific cloud provider, like, solutions. Those are the automation languages. They come with their own set of APIs. Those are a little bit easier. They're a lot more, I would say, well structured because the cloud providers, or like, the automation languages, they have to create a product that appeals to the entire world, not necessarily just a much more smaller audience that could be your company or your organization, if you will. So effectively, we started to expose that to a set of like, smaller groups. We had like, a bi-weekly demo sessions. So effectively, if you wanted to come, we could show you how the API works, what is the appropriate documentation, how we could service it. Like, hey, here's a pre-recorded demo that shows you how to use it. Fast forwarding a little bit, we discovered that people don't necessarily want to read the documentation, but they would gravitate towards, I would say, either Giphies or, I don't know, 30-second pre-recorded videos, maybe all the way up to like, minute and a half. They would either prefer those, or they would, I would say, tolerate them as opposed to having to read documentation. However, the documentation that we created was very helpful in terms of like, being able to onboard different engineers on the team, like, our own team mechanics. And later on, when Gen AI LLM models became a little bit more popular, we actually use that documentation to feed it into the specific like, LLM models. And that helped us create a more of a personalized chatbot experience. So when a developer was struggling with a particular like, API in terms of interaction, or maybe they were running into an error message, they could leverage our kind of like, chatbot that was basically able to provide them a summary of that, which effectively allowed us to scale our support model for the entire organization. And again, to give everybody like a little bit of a context, the technological community at Wayfair at the time was about 600 different product teams across 5 different time zones, 4,000 plus practitioners. So effectively, it was a fairly large like, community that we had to kind of like, build and support for.
Yeah.
I don't know if that answers the question, Casper, but
yeah, and yeah, this is really something that always excites me. Like, if you have an estate where all the logic is in hundreds of different repositories, right? you have repositories for pipelines, you have repositories for configs of this, configs of this, configs of here, right? Then it's so hard for the design of the platform to actually call a single source of truth. Like you essentially need to have API endpoints for your different infrastructure components. You need to have you need to have a way of like pulling the current versions, really retrieve that information, and that feels like a tough problem. But there like a growing number of tools out there that can do that. Also, open sourced and closed source vendors. This is really something. This is just coming up, but this is such an important point here to take a look at because and I hope you don't see this as me sort of overstepping my own rules, but um, I've just looked at really interesting data of just what we're receiving in terms of how, if teams are given the interface choice, right? If you have like you take 1,000 developers in an organization, like, and if they have the interface choice between CLI, API, UI with a portal, code-based interaction, IDE extension, then it's so important interesting to see how the percentage distribution is done. Like, so this is like a recent Gartner briefing. And again, forget the branding and everything. Like this is just about the numbers. 91% is with code. So this year is code, and which sort of makes sense, right? Because if a developer is just, deploying something, they do not want to change their interface. You want to meet them where they are at the moment, right? This could be code, this could be IDE extension, all of this. The CLI is 4%, direct API calls are 3%, so this is all sorts of automation, and the portal use case is 2%. And now let's say sort of a few things about this. This does not mean that, I mean, we have to take this with a little bit of caution because obviously, the portal use cases are not built for every single deployment. Like you wouldn't go into a portal and say like, I'm deploying something. This would be, Git based. But it's so important that if we think about like 100 run-throughs that a developer does, right? Like, what's our conceptual model for where we are actually going to touch platform capabilities? And I'm a big believer that this should sort of follow the first and foremost exactly what you said, Jordan, to where the developer is at that given point in time, to not pull them away from where they are right now. And so, like that idea of keeping the developer as close to the inner loop as possible is so important. And that doesn't mean that portals aren't also important. They are important because they're also for other user personas. Am I getting you correctly there, Jordan?
Yes, you are. And I'll say something that is very important here. The goal of the platform team is to keep making the inner loop more consistent and longer without it potentially breaking out into the outer loop for any given developer. Meaning, hey, platform team, you need to make sure that you accelerate or provide a better experience for the inner loop without a developer having to break out into the outer loop to actually get, I don't know, capacity provision or something else that effectively potentially creates or pulls multiple teams or groups as a part of that. You want to eliminate that behavior or constraint as much as possible over time. It's not possible for you to start there because probably that's not how your organization is set up today. But over time, platform teams should be incentivized to remove themselves from the inner loop by way of automation.
Yeah.
I see a question from Crumpy in the chat. How is the authentication and authorization of APIs handled in this case for consuming them directly in the UI client side logic? We were at a time Wayfair was using a combination of, I would say, a cloud provider. They were using GCP. I think that's public information, so you can probably Google it if you're interested. But effectively, we had to leverage the base provider with that at the time. Most organizations, what you need to end up doing is you need to take your internal identity provider and do that type of mapping between your internal identity and then what the cloud provider actually provides for you. It won't be, I would say, too surprising if you had to build
C'est
your...
une minute, 5 minutes ou c'est une minute, une minute?
Sorry. But also, could you please mute yourself?
Ça marche. Tout de suite.
Perfect.
Sorry, I'll keep going. You have to build a logical construct that allows you to detect changes in the organizational hierarchy within your enterprise. It may potentially turn into a graph-like construct. So effectively, it would be something that gives you or accounts for this team is now named X, or this team now split, or this team merged with another team. Effectively, you want to be able to account for all these org design evolutions or changes. They're probably not as frequent as one would think, but they do happen quite a bit in any organization. Why do you need that construct? Effectively, you need to be able to know which team owns which service. That would be a microservice or any type of an application that effectively runs on top of the platform. That particular level of construct is effectively what you need to basically marry with your public cloud provider, and you can make also other choices around how am I supporting single tenancy, multi-tenancy if I have those constraints. There is a bit of I would say it gets a lot more nuanced and a lot deeper after that, but you definitely need to build that construct at the very least, so you can basically track the relationship between what team owns what service and who is on a particular team at any given point in time, so you can actually do that. A lot of this type of governance does not come with any platform. You have to build it on your own within every organization, and prepare yourself to spend probably an inappropriate amount of time in that space, because that's the right thing to do, not because you sort of you can avoid it. So just prepare to spend a lot more time on governance.
Fantastic. We have one question, or actually two questions, like how to design the whole thing across multi-cloud and across different clouds and across different computes, but also languages and frameworks and everything. How did you solve that, or were you like a single compute, single hoster situation?
Yeah, I didn't have the constraint of having to support a multi-cloud environment as a part of the platform build out, but pretend that you had to do that. You'll always be constrained by what is actually available on each platform. Maybe one of the cloud providers has unique products that don't exist on the other one, which basically turns into technical constraint, or a product constraint into a sociological one. Hey, what are the actual paradigms that we want to be able to surface via the platform? So effectively, when developers are trying to provision their components or compositions that support a given application, they would be landing on a particular consistency of experience. You have the option of realistically, you have the option of, hey, in the example given, I will give you an AWS portal only and an Azure portal only. Or you can basically say, hey, what is the lowest common denominator that I can support in terms of computational paradigms? Maybe this is more infrastructure as a service is a little bit closer, as opposed to platform as a service. Those are the nuances. Obviously, if you have the requirement of being able to support a couple of platforms, you need to account for you need experts who are basically knowledgeable in those multiple clouds. But again, the topic should be really what are the fundamental blocks that I want to support? What is the cost? What is the security? And do I need to provide anything on top that is specific from the perspective of the developers? I don't think you're gonna be. I think it's a harder problem that I will try to surface at the social level, more at a strategy, as opposed to trying to solve it at a technical level.
Yeah, so it also depends a little bit on, so you need to make trade-offs at some point, right? So I don't think the actual complexity is across different hosting providers. I think the actual complexity is across different compute types, because different compute types require very different configuration conventions, right? So it is reasonably simple to build something across large Kubernetes estates wherever they may be, just because the Kubernetes API, it has this very, very structured convention on how, things run. It's also reasonably easy to say, if something requires a Postgres, that we can sort of build an abstraction layer above, and then say, we need a service, and that service will be a container and it will run on a namespace. and it will have the following 6 dependent resources that are all shared. Jordan makes a very good point there, that are all shared across all hosters with different naming conventions, but there is an RDS, there's a Cloud SQL, so Postgres is a pretty standard model. If we have this, we can sort of build an abstraction component on top of whatever might be underneath. And then we can build a translation mechanism of saying, if this is the abstract specification that hits our platform API, let's actually convert this and say, RDS, if we're deploying to a staging environment in RDS with Amazon, this is looking like this. And if we're doing this with Azure, it's going to look like this. And we can sort of match the right infrastructure as code files and then make sure that this gets pushed into the different hosting providers. This is still not super easy, but it is reasonably easy. And that's absolutely doable if you have a good API framework. The complexity, which I don't think we will ever solve, is across different computes. Because if you think about, if you're thinking about the variance of configuration standards for VM, and how little comparison there is even within certain VM setups of any given environment or provider, then this already tells you that it's going to be very, very tough to get a reasonable degree of standardization that allows us to manage this across different systems. So there we will just probably never reach the convenience. And so my recommendation is always to say, don't assume you'll be ever able to build a platform that can rule them all. It's much better if you cluster the thing and say, like, we have one platform focused on this compute, one platform focused on this, one on static hosting of things, one on data engineering. And I think there's even sort of a magic ceiling for performant platforms. I've seen very rarely good platforms that are going beyond 1,000, 1,500 developers, unless you have an engineering organization with 5,000 people on EKS, right? Then this might differ, but that just rarely happens. So I think in reality, and I would be interested in what you think of, Jordan, I often see that from a certain size on, enterprises will remain a 4, 5, 6 different platform world. What do you think about that?
Most of these decisions that are usually business ones as opposed to technology ones. I do think that your point about having to support different runtimes is important. Yes, the way that I've done this in the past is all the different runtimes lived under the same umbrella as a part of a given platform, but I think it would just be difficult for one to create abstraction layers that span multiple clouds, which is why I kind of went towards the, hey, try to if you're building a platform, effectively you'll be doing the logical kind of sharding. Hey, stay within given cloud provider, just AWS or just Azure. What I will do in that particular case is I will try to estimate what are the sizes or what are the cohorts of the actual developer population, what are the actual numbers of applications, what's the demand for each, to basically dictate to me which kind of platform I should try to create more abstraction layers on top of, if you will, to kind of dictate my roadmap. 5 or 6 different platforms. It is possible. I think this is where you probably might be going into closer to the, I would say, McKinsey or ThoughtWorks' kind of definitions of now your entire platform is multiple pillars. That's probably a different type of, I would say, thought exercise that maybe that was the pattern in the past. Maybe in the future is you'll be trying to do a singular platform, and maybe this is where the value of the portal would be, we kind of will be at is the developer community enters for a single portal, but then you have a submenu of options of, hey, maybe one particular screen basically says, if you're AWS application or a native, this is what your platform experience is going to look like, and then you sort of start operating with that logical platform underneath, or your Azure is here, or then GCP or OCI, that kind of maybe break it apart. But in terms of consistency of experience, maybe the portal kind of drives some of that. I don't know if that answers your question. Sorry, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah. I mean, if you're taking something, and I'll just point to other tools, so it's more neutral. If you're taking something like Radius, for instance, that was just donated to the CNCF, which is an open source tool, you are absolutely able to now completely convert an abstract definition into actually moving from one hoster to the other, pretty seamless. But yeah, you're right, and it essentially depends on, again, how capable are your backend APIs, and if they're not actually capable of doing, like, also assuming accounts and roles in the as a platform user, then you will need to just steer this and have the unifying component be the portal layer. I can we maybe, like, what fascinates me about your case is the scale. How have you been able and to actually gain adoption across 5,000 developers? And what was the sort of pushback, and what were the lessons learned on the way? I see many initiatives that actually start off, but then the developers show resistance. How have you solved this?
Sure. Our challenge again was most of our customer base was spread across 5 different time zones. So the time when we wanted to actually do this is I work with my director of product to actually create a compelling strategy or a vision of this is what we think we might have an opportunity to move away or shift the working model over to more of a platform one. So we put that together. It was about, I would say, 2 pages of abstract, 7 pages of FAQ that helped kind of people get a little bit more of a this is what the abstract is, but this is what it's going to look like a little bit more tactically or concretely on the ground. And then the last page was basically, hey, here's what the plan may look like for the next 6 months, kind of a little bit more crisp or tangential in terms of deliverables. And then after that, we decided to not overspend time because we wanted to see if there is going to be an appetite for that to begin with. So we took that, we advertised it to our CTO at the time, and her kind of leadership circle. I will be very transparent. The presentation did not land the way that it was supposed to in terms of particular outcomes. However, we were given the benefit of how can we help you take this to the next step. And this is where I kind of basically asked, hey, is it possible for us to do a roadshow with the individual leadership sort of teams for each of these representatives who sit on the CTO staff? We did most of these. It was about 14 sessions, and for each one of them, we presented, we delivered. That message landed a lot more, I would say, better. And as you kind of we're going through that particular exercise, you basically started seeing a couple of camps emerging. Half of the people who we're presenting to, again, they were kind of director, senior director. Some of them were VPs. Kind of give a little bit context. They were excited. They wanted to be early adopters. The second half were, I would say, a little bit more conservative. They were not as excited, or they were polite and said, hey, maybe I want to see how this develops a little bit before I kind of make any concrete commitments. So effectively, from the folks who were excited about the idea, that's where we kind of got the perspective of maybe we can ask your particular teams to be sort of helping us with the early adoption. So we did that. We created maybe the first 6 months was a lot of internal construction around what the internals may need to look like. We wanted to get enough of a pilot group, if you will, for different teams using different use cases for very simple, very narrow, I would say microservices that still delivered value to the organization, but they were using the new platform and the new mental model in terms of documentation, self-service. We saw, I would say, probably 30, 40 different groups at the time who expressed interest, and we actually had to whittle that down to about, I would say, 8 or 10, if memory serves me right, because we wanted to have different use cases, how they were pressure testing the platform either at scale or they were exercising different components. They also were able to deliver value in 3 to 6 months, meaning, hey, if you're picking something that is taking you more than 6 months, maybe your use case is not appropriate for us at this point in time. It's just too complex. Excuse me. And out of these 8 use cases, we work with those teams for about I don't know, maybe a quarter. And then after that, we were able to kind of say, hey, we work with these particular teams. They saw like, these particular benefits. We asked them, hey, can we actually sit down and create particular user stories and collateral that we can use in terms of if you had to do this without the platform, what would your outcomes look like? And now that you use it, what are those like, in terms of benefits to you? Many of them quoted faster development, less friction, lower cost, better reliability posture, what is it, like security, faster time to like, particular outcomes. They were able to deliver more features with less engineers as well. So effectively, we wanted to capture most of that and use it as a collateral for us to be able to increase the adoption throughout the organization. In parallel, while this was happening, I wanted to increase like, particular messaging within the organization of, hey, this is what's coming. We wanted to kind of like, create a sense of community, not dissimilar to what we're doing right now. So effectively every month, we would invite people, we'll be telling them about what those pilots are, what's actually up and coming. Now that we sort of like, reached the GA, internal GA, then after that, those sessions turn into like, either people presenting on behalf of the platform, meaning what they have achieved, or this is what the roadmap is going to look like for the next 3 to 6 months. Basically conversation points. Maybe it's just like, lunch and learn, if you will, but effectively we use it as in a very effective way. We went from 0 products or like, 0 users on the platform to about, I would say 40 plus in the span of 9 to 12 months. And obviously, like, that pattern, like, keeps compounding after you have that type of momentum. Our messaging wasn't just at that particular level. Like, as I mentioned at the executive level, I specifically had to ask one of our principal engineers, can you please take this message and sort of convert it into practitioner speak? So effectively, the people who are going to be using the platform, we needed to send the same message, the same appeal in terms of like, hey, this is what it may look like to you in terms of like, practical outcomes or whatnot. That was basically the paradigm. Obviously, every 3 months we had to like, circle back with our CTO and her leadership team to basically provide a status update, like, risks and whatnot. But effectively, that's how we drove the program. And when I say we, please, like, have the perspective of while I was a member of that team, the team behind me was fairly large in terms of like, I would say skill sets. We had product folks, we had principal engineers, we had like, a group of DevOps, SRE, software engineers in terms of practitioners. So you kind of seeing or hearing the summary through my lens, if you will.
Can you maybe share, this is a really interesting question here, how you measured this? Like, what was your success metric if it came to the platform adoption?
Yeah, we measured it based on NPS, number of teams, number of distinct services that they were consuming, and then we had our own analytics around, because we were able to kind of like, hack around with Backstage, and we were able to track people's like, consumption of like, the portal. So once you log into Backstage, we know who you are, and then we're able to kind of like, track your activity of where you would be clicking, or like, what are the actual tools, how would you be using it. But effectively, those are the main ones. It was the adoption rate, the NPS, kind of like, the things that I mentioned. Hey, what are specific like key or signature wins that were delivered by way of you adopting the platform? Granted, it was fairly early on. I think we were getting into the medium sort of like, scale or organizational win territory. It wasn't necessarily kind of like, the, I don't know, critical or high just yet, but the kind of like, the momentum was shifting over to those. Those are kind of like, the main ones. If you actually read like, excuse me, if you read some literature on the web, some people will recommend that you measure a team onboarding time. Looking back, I would say that this is probably an opportunity area that we did not overly focus on. And maybe that's because it was, I don't know, a reflection of the environment, or we had momentum, but we really should have been capturing that in terms of like, hey, how easy is it for teams to get started on the platform, like, be able to drive value. We wanted to get there, but it wasn't something that we thought about day one, and maybe we should have.
Yeah, there is this new thing by DX, DX Core 4. Jason, you already also shared a few good ones, Dora, Space, and Heart, and all of this. I really encourage you to look at the DX4. I think find them very compelling because they combine the good stuff from Dora and everything, but Dora the problem that I sometimes have with ROA is that they can be a little bit of an intellectual exercise because it's incredibly hard to get this right and measure right. And you need to spend so much money to actually consolidate the data to get decent DORA metrics. And DX has found like a good balance of making that easier to extract much faster. This is really helpful. Another good question here: is it important for the product person to be highly technical if the organization is still driving the adoption and there is a chief architect of the platform team and a technical program manager? What are your thoughts there, Jordan?
I don't think it was critical for us to have like, somebody who was technical. I think that would have helped them. But I think the main value where we kind of like, saw from like, having a product person on the team is kind of like, holding those customer empathy sessions, setting up those particular feedback loops, being able to be a quick learner and understand what does it mean or what makes an actual customer click, making sure that we surface the right types of metrics and outcomes. I think those are kind of like, the main ones. We did have product managers on the team who had different archetypes. One was more technical, the other one was a little less so. I would say it wasn't a critical factor. Maybe it helped them at the time, but yes, knowledge. I would say knowledge of a public cloud provider as a base platform, assuming like that's where you're building your own like platform. Of the one that you're building on top of, I would say it's probably more valuable, but maybe that falls into the technical skill sets, if you will. And going back to like to the previous question, yes, we did use Dora at the time. Space was, I don't know, up and coming. It wasn't as well defined. DX core didn't exist at the time just yet. So kind of like making sure that folks have that perspective of like the timetable is a few years ago. And heart was not a thing. Yeah, I see that coming for heart.
100%. Want to get back to one question that you had, Mustafa, and that was around like what's a good size from a team perspective from which onwards platform engineering makes sense. What's your gut there, John?
I've always been torn on that particular question, and I gotta be honest, I don't think I have a well-defined answer even for myself today. Purely practically speaking, I think every single organization likely reaches a particular point in their size in terms of, I would say, maybe technical stack, maturation, complexity, number of products, whatever that combination is, where the inflection point of you running without a platform is better as opposed to not. And you hit that inflection point almost quietly, nobody tells you about it, and then all of a sudden like you wake up and like, oh, we should have started building this platform thing maybe, I don't know, 6 or 12 months ago. The problem is if you haven't been in those situations, if you're not looking for those signs, it's always going to be like, all right, the problem space already exists. I just need to start kind of like fulfilling or closing out on that particular like opportunity, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It just shows that you already have a market that has particular problems that needs to be like solved for. If you actually like ask me, Jordan, give me a number, that number could be as low as 50. My personal preference is about 100, 150. That's where you kind of start having that sort of, I would say, maybe concentration of like, of volume where you're going to start seeing that in terms of like, scale. And then if you're kind of like, past that point, obviously, you're probably hearing from people about it.
Does that anybody have different experience? Does that feel like a good threshold?
And again, those are your product teams. So if you're using like an average size of, I would say 8 for a given product team, give or take, maybe it's 10 or 12 teams on average. That's where you start seeing that pattern on like that need emerging a little bit more.
Yeah, resonates a lot with me because I think below it's pretty hard to realize the return on investment because like these platforms are like I think there are people out there that are painting them as simple technical constructs, and they're not. Like they're just really complex. So and they just cost. It's just overhead. And
you just mentioned it very well. You're not seeing your return on investment. Obviously, you're going to be paying for your platform in terms of like having a team to kind of like curate it, but it's also, are you seeing enough executions of the automation by the actual like number of developers? If you're creating automation that people are going to use, but are you Are you able kind of like, eventually get into the black, so to speak? Are you in the money on this? I think that at the lower numbers where you kind of like, around, I don't know, I would say below 100, that map gets very, very difficult to prove. And if people are interested, there is another great paper published by one of the other ambassadors. The name is AJ, I forget the last name, where they do talk about like, how do you actually prove the value of platforms over time. It's a 30-pager. I recommend everyone to kind of like, read it and do it, because it speaks a lot more to the actual financials, and it will really help you with a CFO, a COO type of archetype in the conversation. And especially in the long term of like, when people start doubting or questioning the value of the platform. Most of us as like, technological, I don't know, practitioners who are on the infrastructure side may not necessarily think of this is a problem that we have to solve for. Trust me, you do. You maybe haven't seen it in the long term just yet in terms of like, it being a potential risk to both the platform and subsequently the organization. Sometimes well-meaning, I would say, individuals maybe asking the right questions. And if you don't have the right type of data, that doesn't necessarily end in good outcomes for everybody involved.
Yeah.
What was that again? Could you repeat that? What was the thing to look up?
How do you prove the value of the platform over time? Because it's an investment from a business standpoint, right?
Sorry, I mean, you suggested to some site or document, I think it was.
Yeah. I will share it here towards like, the very end when I get a moment in chat. But yeah, I'll share the direct link.
Thanks.
You can look it up. I'll use the time to answer Brett's question. If you are below that number, you generally just expect individual teams to handle those elements themselves. And I think that's exactly it, right? So if you're like a small team, there's sort of a risk in too much standardization and too much restriction. In small teams, it's actually okay if everybody does everything, right, to a certain extent, and you're doing more freestyling. People own their configurations together. You can call your buddy to help and stuff like this. So I would resist the urge of standardizing too early. I think there is a real risk in that.
Yeah. Speaking of standardization, some organizations are sensitive to the word standards. So be on the lookout for that. You may not know positive word in some cultures.
Dangerous word. That can be dangerous. Yeah. There was you added another point that actually changes this this point, Brett. You said that in heavily regulated industries, and I've worked, for instance, with a defense ministry, with a team with only 100 developers, and for them it made a ton of sense because you had situations, we call them deployment to darkness scenarios, where the user is not allowed to know where they're deploying to, and it's very, very locked down. And so in those cases, you need very heavy abstractions and you need very sophisticated handling in the background to make that possible because you're, I don't know, deploying into a fighter jet or something. And so that's why you can't completely generalize this. And it's absolutely true that the more security aware the organization is that you're working for, the lower the threshold and number from which onwards the platform makes sense.
And yeah, for the folks who may not have seen this in the chat already, posted the link to the 30-pager. It is a relatively straightforward read, but it may take you a couple hours to go through it. The model is not perfect. I think even the authors themselves acknowledge that this is actual work in progress. But based on what I've seen on this particular topic and what's currently available in the community, it's probably the best resource that we have as practitioners as of today. Over time, that might change, but again, this is the most complete one that I have seen. There is a very nice graphic or visual on page 28, which I recommend that all of you take a look at. Maybe that will help you speak a lot more intelligently internally. It gives you some verbiage, it gives you some visualization and links and models around tools to use to speak with different audiences on this particular topic. Maybe it's developers, maybe it's business users, maybe it's C-level execs. That graphic is something that I probably use, I would say, multiple times a week. And again, the verbiage is important, the chart itself is important, and it will become obvious when you see it again, bottom of page 28.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. Yeah. All right. This was a great conversation. Are there any other things that I have a thing that at the back of my head about anything else that we should cover beforehand? And I'll just ask this, and if you think of additional stuff, just put it in the chat. Jordan, did you sort of work with your managers to introduce sticks or carrots to get people to adopt the platform, or did you not go into that territory at all?
When you say managers, is that my own leadership team at the time or across like prospective customers?
No, like, just how do you think about this? Like, how do you think about bringing managers along the ride? Like, how can they support this?
Yeah. I think I may have touched upon this early in the conversation, but to us it was very important that we do not exercise a mandate. If you are happy using or like conducting or doing business within your team, leveraging a particular type of mental pattern, you are more than welcome to keep continuing doing so. It was our responsibility to build a better product that will kind of like provide value to you and team, which will in turn will effectively for kind of like provide you with an incentive to actually like start using the product that's we were building. We specifically requested that there are no mandates from the top down because that effectively creates a disconnect or misalignment of incentives across prospective platform users. You definitely want to kind of approach this from a perspective of I'm a SaaS provider and I need to build the best product internally for my internal users. And it's okay for me to have to compete, and it's okay for me to never satisfy specific parts of the markets that exist internally. Like, it's okay for people or those particular teams to not be a good fit for the platform for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's cultural, maybe they have a different preference, maybe there is an organizational kind of like an objective that doesn't give them the time to actually adapt that platform or actually discover it or research it. Maybe they want to have the freedom of choice, and you actually should be one of the proponents of saying that, hey, we want to provide choice as opposed to like hard mandates. We were forcing ourselves into kind of like you have to appeal to the internal audiences to actually leverage your platform. You should create delight, you should create value, it should not create additional steps or friction or anything of that nature. And again, one thing that I'll mention here is no matter what you do, unfortunately, people are not going to read your documentation. But document everything that you have so you can actually leverage it later on in like other solutions. Do not let that discourage you. This doesn't mean that your product should not have documentation. However, maybe you should have more of a, I would say, workshops, things that you don't necessarily think about or do today. Like, hey, you have somebody on the platform team who would be presenting how to use this particular feature or how to like, get started with, I don't know, from zero, like, to now to kind of like, an actual working deploy in production. It's okay for you to record these. But basically, like, you have to think a little bit more outside of the box. What is not as intuitive as for platform teams is you have to think about your own marketing. You have to think about your consulting and support arms, not just kind of like what you're kind of building and developing as a product. Those particular branches or like I would say like requirements for your success may require for you to hire or have a different type of personnel on the team. It could be just a person who is doing it like part-time, but they basically need to have that, I would say, they need to be strong in those particular areas. If you're not servicing or like satisfying particular needs around your internal marketing and branding within your organization, you don't have like strong support for your product, you don't have like strong consulting, if you will, those things will reflect, I would say, negatively or like neutral at best.
Cool. Yeah. I wanted to hand over the word to Vinay, but he already had to drop, so we won't get to that today. Right, I think this is a good time to wrap it up. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining. John, thank you so much for spending so much time and sharing these valuable insights. I can really feel that you've been on the ground actually doing it. Like I can smell this from 1,000 miles away. If somebody is the difference between somebody talking and somebody actually having gone through the shit. So thank you very much to you to share your success and failure. That's really much appreciated. And I hope we'll see you here very soon. Thank you very much.
Have a good one. Thank you so much for the time, everybody.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.